All right, hello humans. Sorry that I haven't uploaded a video in a while. I've been kind of busy with school and working on a few other things. But I didn't want to leave you with nothing, so I decided to just make this video, which is a lot easier for me to make since I can just spew at the camera without having to write a script. And we're going to talk about my favorite thing to discuss, specifically because nobody wants to discuss it, which is religion, which for some reason has become kind of a touchy subject. So my own views on religion are obviously informed by my own religious upbringing. I was brought up as a Catholic. And of course, it's easy to criticize the Catholic Church given, all the sinister shit that they did, especially in Canada with the residential schools. But in my mind, there was always something extremely powerful and grand about these, massive cathedrals that I would visit, such as the ones in France or in Montreal. And I felt like I was in this place that was, solely dedicated to the attempted communion with something which was far beyond human comprehension and far beyond us in terms of their power and intelligence. And that's what it always seemed like to me. And my mindset regarding Catholicism is very similar to like how J.R.R. Tolkien understood Catholicism. He saw the Godhead as the kind of metaphysical structure that we need to cling to and we need to have faith in order to transform reality and make it better. You put your faith in the higher order and into the idea of the church and in the idea of God, and society itself is transformed thereby and ideally made better. But right now, what I want to specifically talk about was the religious impulse, the psychological impulse to religion, and whether or not we can truly be non-religious. And of course, atheism is currently on the rise in every Western country, but you'd be surprised to know that it isn't the fastest growing, type of affiliation. Interestingly, the fastest growing type of religion is actually Islam, for reasons which speak directly to the utility of religion. And that is the fact that religion is a survival tool. It's something that we as humans invented, and it confers a particular type of benefit to us, evolutionarily speaking. You may think that there's like an advantage in truth. So, for example, if you conceptualize religion as a set of beliefs, many of which are inherently false, you would think that, okay, obviously the superior way is to have an accurate map of reality, something that's more tangible, something that's more useful. And obviously that's true to an extent. Like, the more we understand scientific laws, the more we can utilize technology, build things like electricity and so forth. But fundamentally, evolution does not care about the truth. Evolution cares about survival and the perpetuation of your genes. And fundamentally, you could argue that evolution is what matters. It's kind of ironic that evolution has been championed as this kind of thing which has dispelled the notion of God, but in reality, evolution itself seems to prefer religion, and actually seems to prefer people who believe in God. But this is because people who believe in God are, for various reasons, likely to believe in things like mandates to get married. Again, something like a marriage isn't real. It's a completely metaphysical union between two people. There's nothing objective that binds these two people together other than a priest saying it so. And so it's just this kind of fictional covenant that you make. Nevertheless, this fictional premise, which again is very closely tied to religion, kind of provides a setting in which children can grow up optimally and which children, can grow up at all. And this applies to Islam as well. The reason Islam is growing is because Muslim people are way more likely to have many more kids because, that's seen as a dutiful act in Islam, and it's seen as a dutiful act to have as many kids as possible. And of course, if your kids tend to take the religion that you take, that's the probably greatest predictor of religious belief, is whether your parents believed in religion. And again, within this religious context, it's seen as like a woman's duty to have as many kids as possible and provide for them and take a significant role in raising them. Perhaps a bit archaic, but again, evolution does not care. Evolution prefers delusions if delusions are conducive for reproduction, I guess. And in this case, it is. Even something like dressing up childbirth as a miracle makes people more willing to have kids. A purely biological understanding of childbirth and how that whole thing happens actually reduces the likelihood of somebody having kids, because then it just becomes this creepy thing, like this thing is growing inside of me. And so that's why atheists actually tend to have way less kids than religious people. And again, this is what allows religion to perpetuate. This is the simplest way in which I can explain why religion has an evolutionary advantage. It's because it provides you with a mindset, with a worldview that is conducive to the perpetuation of your own genes. It's, as weird as it sounds, that's kind of why we have religion in the first place. It conferred some kind of advantage, and this is one of the advantages. And again, it's completely metaphysical. By metaphysical, I literally mean like it can't be pointed to in the physical world, and yet it greatly changes human behavior in an advantageous way. But despite everything that I just said, I want to make the case that despite the fact that in the modern Western world, religion is obviously in decline, we are still fundamentally religious. The religious impulse is still within our psychology, and this energy energy, again, has to flow somewhere. And so so many of us are basically engaged in these kind of pseudo-religious behaviors. But of course, we're not overtly religious. We don't specifically say that we're dedicated to this specific religion. But again, behaviorally speaking, it's the same thing. There are obviously differences between the modern kind of pseudo-religious behaviors that I'm speaking about and overt dedication to a specific religion. And these differences are actually quite important to note. But analyzed purely psychologically, we still engage in a myriad of behaviors which are close enough to religion that if aliens came to Earth and studied us, they wouldn't be exactly able to tell the difference. It would take a very keen eye to understand that there's a difference between these things. And so I think fundamentally they would see it as the same behavior. So what are the ways in which we can characterize religion which still appear today? Well, the first thing that I want to talk about is mythology. All religions have mythologies and mythological stories attached to them. The Bible is largely a work of mythology. We obviously know about Greek myths, but at one time these weren't just stories; they were seen as divine and very important, actually, for your religious beliefs. And books like the Ramayana in Hinduism, and there's a whole bunch of Hindu legends which again are worshipped as religious texts, and obviously the Quran also contains numerous mythological stories. Now, humans have never really lost this fascination and this reverence for things which are just stories. In fact, the average person spends a great deal of time preoccupied by fiction. I remember a time not so long ago where the only thing anybody could ever talk about was Game of Thrones. Nobody would shut up about Game of Thrones. Now, this might not seem like a big deal, but if you think about it, it's kind of freaking weird that so many people for the longest time spend such a great deal of their time preoccupied by a fictional story. And obviously right now, many of you are probably obsessed with certain fictional stories with such mythologies. And so in a sense, our early obsession and love for mythology never really left us. We still will have it. We never really moved on from that. And now you might be thinking that, okay, well, obviously there's a clear difference because one of these people know to be fictional and the other people take to be literal truth. And yeah, but also no, because have you ever seen one of these kind of events which are held for Game of Thrones? Just look at the fervor on display here. People are getting insanely hyped. And if I went up to somebody in that crowd and told them Game of Thrones sucks, I'd imagine them getting very personally offended. And so the kind of reverence people can have for fictional stories is immensely powerful. And like, why aren't sociologists studying this in particular? It's very fascinating, actually. And when you see like these massive Harry Potter conventions or Star Wars conventions in particular, you begin to see how much value we as a species place on things which we know didn't happen. Especially when you consider how much money people spend on merchandise and toys and action figures and stuff. You know, I'm not hating, but I'm just trying to show that we are still in the midst of our kind of religious way of thinking where things which obviously did not happen are still preoccupying a great deal of our time and energy. And of course, Jung was smart enough to kind of see what this whole thing was about, why we become so obsessed with mythologies, and it has to do with the archetypal influence emanating from these stories, which kind of relates to our own internal psychology. You know, the simplest way I can put that is that these stories are relatable, particularly to the kind of unconscious architecture of the mind. And there are of course other reasons, because, you know, the collective aspect of being a Harry Potter fan and relating to other Harry Potter fans and, you know, having this shared collective belief in this one thing that we all love and support, you know, that's also another aspect to it and something which is desirable from a social standpoint. But it's also true of religions. Religions are fundamentally communal affairs. It's one of the major reasons people are drawn to religions, is because you can, you know, transcend your own individuality. It's no longer me in my own mind, but rather us as a collective, that we all dedicate ourselves to this one thing. And of course, as social beings, as social animals, that feeling for group transcendence is very desirable and something which people crave. But another thing which I keep trying to make, this is the essential point that I keep trying to make, is that fiction is important. It isn't just something that we do for fun or entertainment. There are lessons in fictions and truths in fiction which are arguably more important than the things that we can discern or ascertain from rationality, things which are relevant for your own journey through life. When Harry realizes that he has to die in order for him to defeat his enemy, there is a message being conveyed here that speaks to a psychological reality which pertains to every single individual, which everybody at some point needs to confront. And so fiction often supplies us with wisdom which is more useful, arguably, and more practical than merely just collecting scientific facts about the world. If you are struggling, fiction and fictional ideas can sort of be rejuvenating. There's a reason I read Return of the King whenever I feel like shit. It inspires me to overcome my problems with bravery and courage. There's nothing you can study in the remits of science that tell you that specifically. It's relevant for how to act in the world. Science is a collection of facts, but, you know, it's not obvious what we should be doing in life and how we should proceed through life. And yet fiction fiction does seem to supply this to an extent. And so these Star Wars fandoms and Harry Potter fandoms, which I think are among like the largest in the world, they also prominently feature archetypal ideas and archetypal imagery. And the utter reverence which people can have for something like Star Wars or something like Harry Potter makes a lot of sense when you understand the human psyche as something which naturally seeks out images and depictions which can kind of illuminate its own internal condition. And this is exactly why religious mythology was also revered. It wasn't just considered like a bunch of historical facts, but there was something immensely significant about these stories which illuminated ourselves, which helped us to understand ourselves and our relationship to the world better and in a more useful way. You know, that's why I argue that something like the story of Adam and Eve clearly didn't happen. You know, people get offended when I say that, but in my opinion, it didn't happen. And yet the reason we still revere it as a story is because of this archetypal significance. The story itself conveys a very archetypal image, and the human psyche is naturally drawn to that. And that's why this story becomes held up as like this divine thing, because it seems like it's literally sent by the gods. And that's what it feels like. But, you know, given the amount of time people are dedicated to something like Star Wars, just check here on YouTube. There's like 100 channels that discuss nothing but Star Wars. And I posit once again that aliens wouldn't see the difference between a Comic-Con convention and going to church. Only with a fine microscope would they be able to tell that there's actually different things going on here. And, you know, and there are various fan communities. I've only mentioned a few, but there are obviously big fan communities for various entities. And again, it's a sense of collectiveness, which is also important and something which also needs to be considered. But again, there's also the fact that different stories kind of illuminate different aspects of the human archetypal experience. I used to think Twilight was the dumbest shit ever until I started to understand female psychology and realized that like a vampire and a werewolf is kind of a way in which the human female mind sometimes perceives the masculine. And so I began to understand it. And I began to understand why these books are so popular with women. And it may seem like I'm talking shit about these people, suggesting that they're obsessively fanatical. Some people are, but frankly, there's a logical reason for it, which is also the same reason why people are so fanatically obsessed with their religions. And, you know, I'm not excluded from this. Like, I'm a huge Dune fan, as some of you know. I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan. I believe both of these works, which again are completely mythological, completely fantastical, not real, didn't happen, and yet I view them as extremely important. And to a certain degree, they deserve our reverence and our respect. I made an entire video explaining why Dune is so archetypally significant. And that in and of itself explains why people can become so obsessed with Dune and why it's one of the most popular books of all time. But again, this influence is largely unconscious. That's an important thing to make note of. You can pick it apart like I did in my video, or you can just feel its influence without actually dissecting it. And that's the case with religion as well. The story of the Buddha or the story of Jesus or the story of Hercules works on us unconsciously. It's only when we discover the idea of psychology that we actually go back and pick it apart and see what it was and how it was affecting our unconscious minds. Now, I actually left out one major fandom, probably one of the largest of all time, which is quickly subsuming all culture, all pop culture, and that's the MCU. And I did this on purpose because it perfectly segues into another fundamental characteristic for religion, and that is the reverence for certain metaphysical beings, gods and demigods and angels and saints. Any fictional character is similar to a god in at least one respect. The fact that we sort of act like they're real, even though they aren't, or at least, they aren't tangible. I can't see God, and yet I speak about him as though he is real. Frodo isn't real, and yet I still have conversations about him as though he were real. But gods play a very particular role, and this is most easily seen, in my opinion, with Greek gods, because they were quite different to how you would imagine a polytheistic religion. When you think of a polytheistic religion, you imagine like there being several gods and everybody worships multiple gods. But in reality, people would just pick their favorites and worship them and, visit those temples. So if you liked Ares the best because you were a soldier or something, and you just were really into war or whatever, then you would worship Ares. Ares would be your guy. You'd be a fan of Ares, so to speak. But your wife may be more into Athena. Now, of course, there were also gods associated with different places and different cities. And so by proxies, you probably wouldn't worship Athena if you were a Spartan because, screw those Athenians and their democracy and philosophy. Bunch of bitches. But the important thing that I want you guys to take from this is that these gods are idealizations. They are metaphysical creations of what the ideal being is supposed to be. In other words, you should strive to model your own behavior after these gods because they were understood to be perfect, like the perfect templates of the optimal people. And they exemplify human traits and show us exactly what we would be if we strove for perfection. And this also explains why certain figures like Hercules, Achilles, and Leonidas, some of these fictional, some of these real, Hercules may have been a real guy, but obviously he didn't do all that stuff they did in, Kingdom Hearts. But again, these figures were eventually treated like gods because we saw in them what we should be because, they were so legendary in their actions, and they presented themselves as models that we should attempt to emulate. And the more we emulate these metaphysical ideals, which again are fictional, the more godlike we become. And you might see where I'm going with this. And that's that these Marvel heroes have effectively taken the place of gods. We have become unconsciously polytheistic yet again. People essentially worship Captain America and Iron Man and Thor. Thor in particular is especially ironic because he actually was a god in Norse mythology. So it's like he's making a comeback. Jordan Peterson made this point, and I think he's exactly right about this. We revere these fictional heroes and these fictional people because they are templates of what we could one day be if we strive for it. Both in terms of being a hero and also in terms of having the right moral values. That's why they're very, morally rigid, especially someone like Captain America. And sometimes Captain America and Iron Man have different morals, and then so you pick which one is you identify with more. Again, no different than religion in the past when you picked one of these gods who you thought was the one that reflected your values more than the other ones. And another funny thing is that we dress up as these figures for fun. Well, so did the ancient Greeks and the Romans. They dressed up like the gods for certain festivals and other occasions. And it isn't just a curious fact or a side thing that we do, that we have these metaphysical idealizations that we try to emulate and try to replicate. It's also immensely important. We need to have such metaphysical archetypal characters who embody the ideals we want to strive for, because nobody is perfect and everybody carries a shadow, but we need to have our eyes fixed on a target of what we should attempt to reach. And through that, true human excellence is achieved. Humans didn't become these unbelievable beings capable of this crazy world that we've built without first imagining beings who were beyond us, who were super powerful. And then by trying to be like these beings, this is what the result is. And again, in a similar way, we can choose which of these heroes best reflects our own traits and values. For me, it's Doctor Strange. I'm a big fan of Doctor Strange. And I know people who argue pointlessly about which fictional hero would beat this other fictional hero, almost as if they're real. But again, the point I'm trying to make is that this impulse to look up to metaphysical beings, again, don't actually exist in the physical world, is very ancient within us, and we've been doing it for a long time, and we haven't really stopped now. We may think that we're atheists, but really the religious impulse is built in, and we're still doing it unconsciously. And we just give it a slightly different name. And I don't think it would be controversial to say that Marvel has become like a religion, and just like a religion, just like the Catholic Church, it's immensely profitable. In fact, we also see this obsessive desire to control the canon and establish what's actually canonical and what's not canonical in Marvel, the same way the Catholic Church tried to decide which books of the Bible were canonical. So, there are many parallels and they run deep. I probably haven't even touched on all of them. And again, this isn't anything to be alarmed by. As humans, it's a very natural impulse to have role models who we attempt to emulate. Most learning occurs through the imitation of people who we perceive to be better than us and perceive to be higher than us. But whereas monkeys just imitate, their elders, we imitate beings who don't even exist. This is a remarkable development, and one that was completely necessary to get humans on the track to become these godlike beings. This is how we've been able to achieve a high degree of behavioral and psychological sophistication, because people trying to emulate Christ, by not being a dick, are attempting to achieve a high degree of spirituality, which does not merely occur through nature. My genes don't tell me to be like Christ. It occurs solely on this kind of metaphysical planes which humans simultaneously inhabit along with the physical world. That's why I've always made the case that humans are fundamentally metaphysical beings, because we can believe in things that aren't immediately present. And of course, that is what enables us to go beyond merely the natural world of our instincts. Now, here's a question that I want to pose. Is it better to worship these metaphysical ideals who don't exist, or to worship real ideals, as in people who really do exist? Because if you take any of these Marvel characters, they're played by real people, and we also worship these celebrities. In fact, I see celebrity extension as fundamentally an extension of this, and not necessarily disconnected from the metaphysical perspective, because, you don't really know a celebrity. You just kind of see them on the screen, and you see them in interviews, so you don't actually know who this person is, and yet we kind of revere them like they're these godlike beings. Despite the fact that they're probably they're probably just normal people, and they probably have shadows, and they probably have a dark side, but of course we don't ever see that, and so we just see these idealizations, and it's kind of related in that sense. But there's a more Jungian reason, and it's kind of hard to explain, for which reason we really like actors, specifically actors, and why we treat them like they're gods. And this is due to the fact that it takes an enormous amount of confidence to be an actor, to have thousands of people see you. You have to be able to manage your own self-consciousness. But since actors can be so confident despite being constantly under the spotlight, we see in them, again, what we could ideally be. Because fundamentally, as a human, you don't want to be always controlled by other people. You don't want to, change your behavior because there are people in the room. You want to be free to be yourself, and actors kind of embody this. And of course, this is related to the self-archetype. They are able to be themselves, and of course, that's our minds naturally gravitate towards that idea. In fact, there are famous people who gain their notoriety for no other reason that they're just obnoxious and don't care about other people's judgment. I would argue that people like Logan Paul are famous for this exact reason. He's just an obnoxious dude who does not care at all about other people judging him. And even though he's an asshole, he's accrued this large following of dumb, gullible children who genuinely worship him. And another point that I should make is that humans are predisposed to worshiping such figures, to having such role models. We can't stop it. You can't just train this impulse out of your kids, for example. So you as a parent might want to ask yourself, do you want your kid to worship Jesus or Logan Paul? Because psychologically, he's predisposed to worship one of them, or rather look up to one of them, which is why parents should be conscious of the role models their children adopt, whether metaphysical or real, because their minds naturally find role models, and if these role models aren't being well chosen, they can end up idolizing somebody like Logan Paul. Sorry if there are any Logan Paul fans watching this. I'm talking a lot of shit, but if you are a Logan Paul fan, you should probably leave. But another point that we can make is that the reason we worship celebrities and famous people is because they themselves represent human excellence. Sports are exactly like this. Why do we look up to athletes? It's because athletes in our minds are kind of like these metaphysical ideals, except they're real. And they show the results of what happens when you push yourself to your absolute limits, in this sense, in a physical sense, but also in a mental sense. And so in that sense, they can be quite inspirational. And when you understand the amount of dedication and sheer grind that some of them go through, it shows what humans are capable of. And naturally, an allure surrounds many athletes. And this easily explains why so many people worship athletes like they're gods. Sports in general are interesting and very similar to religion, especially the communal aspect, because, we're all cheering on these specific entities who we view as gods. Entities, I'll call them humans. But we all worship these humans together, these players together, and it creates this collective shared belief in these particular people. And just like religion, sports are very profitable. So while there are many related elements between sports and religions, I hesitate to call them full-blown religions, but they are very similar, especially the way we can worship, Michael Jordan or Babe Ruth or Muhammad Ali like they are gods. They are effectively taking on that role. Great actors as well, because acting is very difficult and you must be very talented to do it. But also artists and musicians. Somebody like Jimi Hendrix, with that extreme skill that's even hard to fathom. It makes a lot of sense why we revere such figures, because, again, they seem almost like they're godlike. But not only that, but the people who emulate such figures and try to be like them, they go on to be the next generation of, great musicians who we worship. And so, there's this continuous process going on where, one generation emulates the one generation, and then it keeps going on forward, and human excellence continues to develop, and so humanity becomes more and more godlike through this process. Also, smart people like, Roger Penrose or Stephen Hawking. We stand on the shoulders of such giants because that's the only way to surpass them. So again, the main point that I want to point out, and the thing that I mentioned in my last video, is that just getting rid of religion doesn't get rid of the religious impulse. It has to go somewhere, which is why, celebrity worship is a thing and why we worship the MCU so much, because we've taken that away from religion and it has to go somewhere. But of course, this can be very dangerous if we project this idealization onto the wrong people, especially these days when we elevate certain political leaders as our saviors. Jung often talked about the fact that when we abandon religion, we begin to worship the abstract principle of the state, which itself becomes like a god. And in many ways it is. A state is a collection of people that together can, and when it operates in harmony, can accomplish godlike feats, like going to the moon and such. But these godlike feats can also be utterly destructive. There are gods of destruction for a reason. There are gods of chaos that absolutely destroy everything for a reason. That humans are very much capable of becoming the destructive god. Hitler is the best example of this. He positioned himself as the savior of Germany during a time of declining religion, and thus this excess religious energy was instead flowing towards Hitler, who became, for all intents and purposes, like a Christ-like figure. In this case, he's the Antichrist, but he tried to rejuvenate Germany's appetite for spirituality through violence. And the result was, the fucking craziest event in human history. Stalin and Mao did exactly the same thing. They different ideology. In fact, one can argue the exact opposite ideology to fascism is communism. But because of this decline in religion, they played the exact same role. They utilized these same archetypal energies which were kind of out of balance. And this is a personal concern for me today because, again, religion is declining, and it does seem like we're elevating certain political figures as though they were saviors, rather than servants, because that's what they should be. They should be servants to us. We shouldn't be servants to them. And again, people are becoming fanatically obsessed with them. And again, that's the point I was trying to make in my last video. This is a very dangerous thing. But to end on a more hopeful note, I can't stress enough the value of fiction. This is both in my opinion and in just a general description. We exalt many fictions because humans, again, seem to occupy a realm between the physical world and a world which exists solely in our heads. And we can't be humans without this fine balance. And this is especially true with respect to our moral development, which again hinges completely on metaphysical ideals and fiction. Morals aren't real, we made them up. Yet believing in morals allows human behavior to change for the better. Again, morals are purely fictional. They aren't written into the laws of the universe, but there is a value, a great human value. And in fact, it's hard to even imagine what would happen if we abandoned the fictional premise of morals, because it's just so innate in human behavior to believe in things which aren't objectively true. Now, I did say earlier that I would discuss some differences between these sort of pseudo-religious behaviors that I've been describing and actual religions. And I think that the main difference is ritual. The fact that all religions kind of have ritualistic things that you do. For example, baptism, marriage is also a kind of ritual. But of course, the ritualistic aspect is something I find very interesting because it does have a very particular psychological effect upon us. Another kind of ritualistic thing is observing certain religious holidays. Christmas is a good example. We're taking time to specifically acknowledge something which we feel to be important. My personal belief is that we need some kind of replacement for ritual. Like, we need to have specific days for things that we reflect upon, and we need to make space for kind of certain things like Thanksgiving and, things like baptism, that are more participatory. And we need to add significance to things like weddings and to funerals. There needs to be a spiritual significance attached to these things. In other words, I feel like there needs to be a sense of the sacred in society. As much as we love our Marvel heroes and whatever, the kind of sense of the sacred, which a thing like a church has, is very much lost. And I think we need to build that up again. Because again, it is an instinctual archetypal energy, the idea of the sacred, and it can be utilized for good. And it's a very powerful feeling when you're in the presence of the sacred. It's the exact feeling I get when I visit these beautiful churches and see the paintings and the architecture. I get the sense of this grandeur, this thing that's so far beyond me, something that I can't fully comprehend, and yet here I am kind of interacting with it. That feeling, I think, it needs to be cultivated in today's society, although I'm not exactly sure what the source would be. But yeah, hopefully that conveyed my thoughts on the matter. These things are always fun to make because I can just, rant at the camera. And humans are freaking weird, man. But it's a privilege to be one. Anyways, thanks for watching. Have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.